So we begin our 6-part series with consciousness, or the illusion of self. There are many schools of thought in regards to consciousness. Many neurobiologists still hold that it is something of a mystery. However, when we're exercising the part of us that we perceive as self, it seems that we're activating the same part of our brain responsible for conversation. In regards to consciousness, I hate to disappoint you, but I tend to view it as simply the ongoing conversation we have in our heads. This explanation is far too simple for most people, but I think many people's desire to complicate the subject of consciousness comes from a place of narcissism. Most of us, not just Christians, want to believe that there's something else, that there's someone else behind our eyes, not just a brain. We want to believe that there's a brain and a soul. It's incredibly tempting to believe that our consciousness or our self is connected in some way to our spirit. Now, as I'm sure you know, our desires can be a barrier to open-minded thinking. So before we continue, ask yourself if your consciousness or your sense of self is not connected to your soul. Would you be disappointed? Does just considering that make you uncomfortable and make you feel sad in some way? If the answer is yes, I want you to bookmark that feeling. Maybe even meditate on that for a while. Isolate that discomfort and recognize that nearly all discomfort is a barrier to our learning. I want to approach this subject with as much sensitivity and empathy as I can. So I'm going to emphasize from time to time that none of what I'm saying means that there is no God, nor does it mean that whatever religion or belief system you've chosen was a bad choice. What we're examining here is whether particular theological assertions make sense. It is not an attack on you or your family. For many, their religious belief is a direct connection to the feeling of family. If you listened to the introduction, you'll know that this is because both subjects, family and religion, elicit oxytocin from within us. What's interesting in regards to consciousness is that on some level, we all know that our consciousness is not connected to our soul, but we avoid seeing it. Consider this. When most people think about what it would be like to have a heart transplant, as weird and as scary as it is to imagine that, I am sure most people believe that they would wake up from that surgery with their consciousness still intact. There's no doubt that some people might say that they feel weird, and perhaps even that they feel different, like a different person. But most people will concede that if you have a liver transplant, heart transplant, whatever transplant, you will still be you when you wake up. But imagine this. If or when brain transplants are available, would you have the same confidence that you would wake up being you? Most people who are being honest will say no. Now let's take the flip side of that. Imagine that your body is dying and the technology is available to put your brain in a new body. Do you suppose that you will still be you? I think most people would hypothesize yes. So in some sense, it would appear that most of us do have a great deal of stock in the idea that our sense of self or consciousness begins and ends in the brain. If I may continue, the way we know that our sense of self is not a spirit or soul is because many people get a bop on the head and lose their sense of self, or change their personality, or like my mother who died from brain cancer, they might keep their personality, but loop the same conversation over and over again. Anyone who's watched a family member slowly die from Alzheimer's or get dementia, or simply grow old has seen this disconnect in thinking and self and consciousness take place in front of their eyes. Now let me ask you this. Does this mean that this person began to experience some type of disease in their soul? Did their soul start to deteriorate? No, the slipping of consciousness is entirely of the brain's making, or at least the body. One of the reasons I know that consciousness is just an ongoing conversation we have with ourselves is that the conversation changes, and the change is completely consistent with our life experience. The vocabulary of our conversations change. The conversation changes in parallel to our life experience. And as we'll talk about later in the section on idolatry and the God in our head, even the conversation we have with God in our head changes. And it so happens that that conversation, the answers we get from God, change in parallel to the knowledge we gain over time as we grow older. For example, if your 4-year-old self were to pray and ask God something, you would imagine the God in your head answering one particular way. Now ask the same God in your head the same question when you are 60 years old and having read the Bible from one side to the other 30 times. The answer you get from the God in your head has a 100% chance of being different if you're being honest with yourself, if you're being honest. But why is that the answer is different? God isn't different. The reason is because the conversation you're having is with yourself, and your answer changes in parallel to the amount of life experience you've had. We chose to speak about consciousness and the illusion of self first because it is an excellent segue to our next conversation, which will be about personal accountability and choice. Now, I am not religious, but in religion's defense, there is what's called anthropomorphic language and phenomenological language, also known as the language of appearances. See, our vocabulary is just what it is. My part of a conversation can only involve words that I know. Ancient people, when they said heart or mind or soul or head, depending on how far back you go, they didn't realize many purposes of a brain. They didn't know the liver filtered toxins. They didn't know the heart pumped blood necessarily. It wasn't just a fact that the human brain was the body's computer, so to speak. So they talked about things using the vocabulary they had. For example, if I'm describing a dinosaur and I say it had the head of a serpent and swords for teeth, well, I don't actually mean that it was a giant snake head or that it had literal swords for teeth. I'm just describing to you something that I saw using the vocabulary I have. And I think many people do that when they talk about soul and mind and heart and spirit. Not everyone has the same idea of soul or mind or heart. In fact, all of these words are homonyms. It's certainly no revelation to anyone to hear that the word heart has several different meanings, at least several. So, thank you for sticking around with me this far. Be sure and keep an eye out for the other 8 parts to this series. Check out the book Question Things, link in the description below. A little update on our organization. We're still in the business of trying to rescue kids and currently looking into allegations of human trafficking through the country of Turkey. I've been asked if I'm taking donations. I'm not, but I can refer you to 3 organizations that are. I've worked with 2 of them. Links are also in the description below. I greatly respect your desire to seek out effective altruism.